So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Makazi podcast on topical urban issues all over Africa. And I am your host, Pata Dolwa, and today with me in the studio is Caleb Ruto. And today we shall be speaking about one of the more topical urban development issues, disaster management. And in Kenya, in the recent past, several incidents of disaster management or in that sort of space have happened, and questions are being asked about Kenya's preparedness when it comes to disaster management. So this evening we attempt to explain aspects of disaster management from a layperson's perspective, and to help me to do this is Caleb Ruto here with issues and questions, and I will try as much as possible to see how best to respond.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I think this is an interesting topic to discuss because we've had a lot of conversations surrounding disasters, especially with what happened in Abakasi recently in Nairobi with the explosion that occurred at a gas depot. It seems that that's time and time again there's always disasters that seem to occur, and what I'm not really impressed with is the management of these disasters, where we have people coming up to TV stations, maybe holding press conferences that maybe are not within the scope of what our disaster management plans have. Like, is the president involved in some way? Is the deputy president involved in some way? Is these things clearly defined? When you come down to now actually getting to response times, do we have the necessary infrastructure? Are the forces that are supposed to be handling these disasters, are they equipped with the right equipment? So there's a lot of questions that I had surrounding this. And the approach that I think we're going to tackle today is looking at the levels, what disaster management is like at the various levels of government, that is county and national government.
Mm.
And then maybe you can give us a history of disaster management in Kenya.
You ask a lot of questions in one sentence, and since I do not pretend to be government, I can only volunteer some information on what a typical policy environment should look like.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we must not attempt to go at answering this question like the government would. And I think the best way to approach it is to have the understanding that governments must prepare to a certain extent, to a large extent, to respond whenever there is an emergency. And I do not also want to go into the academic definition of what disaster is, but I think let's just speak to it in a simple manner, such that people understand that from time to time, there could be emergencies taking place in various environments, depending on what vulnerabilities there are in those environments. And you can describe emergencies in any context. It could be on the road where there are road accidents, and it could be floods whenever we have seasons like El Nino, when there's plenty of rain, and therefore the vulnerability for floods is accentuated because that's the season of excess, rain, and therefore you have excess water production, and therefore someone has to have a regime in place for responding to situations like that. So all these cycles, that you could be next to a volcano which is still active, for example. You could be living on the coastline where sometimes you have tornadoes and all manner of potential vulnerabilities for disaster to take place. So there are contexts in which disaster is likely to take place. So when a country has a very good forward planning and disaster management strategy, it attempts to forecast,
Yeah.
and you cannot be too accurate. It attempts to forecast the possibilities, to be able to do monitoring,
Yeah.
and to be able to put in place early warning systems to respond to different potential disasters or emergencies.
Okay.
Okay, a good country ought to have such a strategy, and therefore, when you do a mapping of potential hotspots or vulnerable, environments, then you simulate into your strategy potential responses, and therefore the government would tend to have policies and strategies that prepare the citizenry, to be able to respond to such situations from time to time. And I think that to a large extent, the government of Kenya, as far as I'm concerned, when I was pretty much close to some of these things, has some plans and strategies to do that. And in the urban sector, you can much more meaningfully predict the kind of disasters, for example, flash floods, or fires or tornadoes, and prepare disaster management strategies that are responsive enough to reduce the damage and to prepare the institutions and the citizens to respond in a manner that lessens adverse impacts of disaster or emergencies.
Okay.
So you see, it's a very complex
It is.
sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, so let's try and, I guess, break it down.
Yes.
I'm going to try and give you examples of disasters that have occurred. And basically, I want you to, using your expertise, maybe break it down what would be the response mechanism for some of these things. So we had, for example, floods that occurred in November last year, especially in Taita Taveta County. And there were some fatalities. Property was destroyed. And from the information that I gathered, there were like around 15 people who lost their lives. So in that scenario, what would be the proper disaster management response? Yeah.
I'm not sure that I have the entire range of answers because, I'm an urban specialist. So you may want me to answer questions around spaces where I don't have that much expertise or even knowledge. But generally speaking, I think if you have established vulnerabilities of any, places, localities, you have proper understanding of cycles, climate cycles, and river flows or flood flows, and so on and so forth. And if over 100 years you've estimated what kind of impact every flood brings with it, okay, you may want to establish thresholds. You may want to have mapping done so that you ensure that people do not settle in areas that are flood prone, for example. And so in typically rural areas, or typically in regions and places where floods are likely to be expected or had, then you must put beacons. You must mark areas unfit for human habitation that are vulnerable to flooding if during the season for rains, and evacuate people beforehand. Sometimes you don't do these things very well because even when you have standards, even when you've marked out and mapped places of vulnerability, sometimes the political expediency of the day makes nonsense of your attempts to ensure that people only settle in a manner that removes them from the dangers or from the possibility of getting affected negatively by floods. Okay? So that's my response to that. Okay? Map out areas, ensure that people do not settle in floodplains or along pathways, that the water might need to drain, and so on and so forth. Okay? That would be the preparedness that the county government, for example, does have in its strategies. But I'm not sure that they actually do these things.
So what I'm gathering is that we have like we probably have good early warning detection. We've seen examples of it occurring whenever the meteorologists give us an assessment of weather patterns, whether it was El Nino that came, and we had. I think it was very unique in the sense that they gave their directions, and then the government came up with their own.
Yes, I think that I can support what you're saying. It's important for early warning systems to be in place, and it's not just the meteorological department; it's other related, departments that need to, and entities need to speak to early preparedness and early warning systems, and ensure that they put out the necessary information so that people are not caught unawares. But sadly, in our country, sometimes political expediency, makes nonsense of professional approaches to these things. I do not see the strategic role of politics in determining early warning for citizenry. But if they choose to do so, then they must play to the, rule, because disaster is something that you don't play politics with. You allow the professionals to pronounce themselves on it, and you urge the people as a leader to follow the advice of professionals. But political leaders do not seem to know any restraints. They latch onto everything, even when they are not required to.
They want to be the face of everything.
They want to be the face of everything. And by the way, leadership is not just political leadership. I think politicians should learn to respect professionals as leaders as well, and allow them to be the ones to pronounce themselves on matters where they're the best ones to pronounce themselves. So politicians must allow other citizens also to enjoy leadership. And professionals in disaster must be seen as leaders in disaster management.
Exactly. And I think what you just said is kind of true, because we have this institution called the National Disaster Management Unit. And from doing the research that I was doing for this particular episode, it became apparent to me that there are actually things that were put in place for disaster management. There's the National Disaster and the Emergency Response Plan that is under the Ministry of Interior. But whenever we come to now disaster mitigation or the disaster response, I don't even know who's the head of that particular unit. We don't know whether they're involved. Communication, I think, has always been one thing that is poor for them. We always find that it's the Red Cross society that we interact with, or it's maybe the CEO of Safaricom in the case when there was drought. He was the face of the disaster response plan.
And that sends a lot of signals that may be confusing in effect. But the point is, and without saying that I'm the expert on disaster, I know something about disaster from an urban point of view, where I claim some expertise. But the point is that when you have a disaster, probably on a national scale, then you do need the Interior Department. The Ministry of Interior is that department that has all the provincial administration. In other countries, that would be local government as well. But in a country such as ours, it is the provincial administration under the Ministry of Interior that has a footprint everywhere in the Republic. And it has the police, for example, and it has other arms of government that have a coordinating function. And therefore, when disaster strikes, when there is an emergency, you do need a very strong coordinating function. And the Ministry of Interior actually has a very central role in coordinating government business or government affairs. And therefore, where you have so many players having to look at something of an emergency nature, then you require someone else to be able to coordinate, whether it is an earthquake, whether it's a collapsed building, whether it is sadly, when there are road accidents, the Ministry of Interior doesn't seem to feature very prominently, except the traffic police. And I think in a different episode we could speak about managing emergencies on the transport corridors. I think it could be improved to perform even better. But when it is in spaces around the country, then you do see the need for somebody to be in charge of coordinating the various diverse agencies and groups of persons involved in managing such occurrences, and so that things are done in a very systematic and predictable manner. And yet information is also very crucial when it comes to managing such events. And not that Safaricom are the best place to do that, but I think Safaricom, in terms of communication in this country, have some of the most I would say widespread infrastructure for information communication around the country in terms of masts and radio stations and so on and so forth. So sometimes you cannot help but appreciate that they play a strategic role. Okay?
Yeah. I would think that they would benefit from having a similar system to the Western countries. Whenever there's something happening, there's amber alerts. Why not integrate that into Safaricom's suite of services? I think that could be an interesting thing.
As a techie, you see that very easily. And yet, again, I think when you look at countries such as Kenya, you can always say that that is work in progress, okay? Because we haven't pretty much found the total solution to responding to disaster.
Okay.
So I think there is a long way to go, including the use of technology to make it a little bit more responsive. And therefore, nothing should be left out of the pool of ideas that may be necessary for this to happen.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's try and now bring it home to your area of expertise. We're looking at urban spaces. There has to be a certain level of, I think, disaster planning. And sometimes I struggle to think whether that's something that is integrated when people are doing, especially buildings. Because we've seen a lot of cases where buildings
It's a good
collapse.
question. It's a very good question. Yeah, indeed. It's a good question. And
how sensitive are we?
Coming from the urban, built-up environment, I think this subject is difficult for me because we fight a lot in the urban space when it comes to whose territory is it, who should make decisions, how urban plans are prepared, what should be the content of urban plans. And very often, when people are looking at urban plans, they speak about environmental impact of urban development. Okay, and that has been pushed very, very strongly over the years because it's become necessary to look at what happens to the environment when urbanization becomes so intense, and that the urban systems of built environments are being created without regard to environmental considerations, not just within the built environment, but also that which happens on the peri-urban fringe, where there is a lot of land, urban sprawl, and so on and so forth, loss of agricultural land, and so people are inclined more to speak to environmental issues. But much less will be spoken to from the point of view of disaster management. But if you want to speak to disaster preparedness with regard to urban systems, I think even when you're selecting sites for urban development, you really need to take into consideration the vulnerability of the locations where you're putting your urban system or your town. For example, in Congo, there is a mountain called Nyiragongo, and it is a very active volcano. So there is a city next to that mountain, and every time that mountain erupts, the volcanic lava, the hot lava, always floods the city. Now, somebody has to think very seriously whether that city should not be removed and taken to an alternative site. If you're locating a city on a coastal, in a coastal area where it's prone to tornadoes and to flooding
Yeah.
and increasingly today to floods or rising water levels,
Tsunamis, yeah, as well as-
tsunamis due to climate change, then you must begin to think very seriously about the vulnerability of the city to certain, disaster impacts, and therefore you've got to think about it. Okay, if you are in a place where they're in a forested area, in North America in particular, for example, in Australia, in places where forestry is done on a large basis, and you have frequent forest fires, then you must really think very carefully about that.
Yeah.
But then when you're also designing a city, then what you must give serious consideration is when you're now doing a high-rise city, like people tend to think that Nairobi needs to have a high-rise city in Kileleshwa, in all these places,
Yeah.
but they are not thinking about the disaster management aspects of a high-density city, because that means, for example, if you had 20 people in an acre,
Yeah.
you're having to put 1,000 people in that acre. Okay? And that means that you have increased the probability for fires, for example. You've increased the human, incidents in that space. So the activities are such that,
Yeah.
anything can happen. The vulnerability to accidents, to fires, to whatever it is extremely high, because that has become an intense,
Yeah.
activity zone as opposed to a very low density activity zone.
Yeah.
So, yes, you must think very carefully about what kind of disasters can be expected in these spaces where the population has moved to probably 20,000 people to 1,000,000 people.
Yeah.
So you must design the streets in such a way that you can evacuate people very fast, that emergency vehicles like ambulances and fire, tenders,
Yeah.
what do they call them?
Brigades.
Fire brigade can access very quickly. You have to have the high-rise buildings designed with self, in such a manner that the fast response to the fire is within the building.
Yes.
It's part of the architectural and engineering design of a building, and so on and so forth. You must have something they call fire hydrants on the street, which means points on the street, across the street, where you can get water, bulk water, for the purposes of fighting fires.
Yeah.
Okay, and so on and so forth. So I'm just giving an example of some of the things that you need to do to ensure that you can forecast and provide in cases where rapid emergency responses can be effective. So there's a series of things that you have to put in place. Okay? You have to allow for open spaces in certain very highly dense places, so that people can flood into these places whenever there is a high-rise fire, incidences of disaster and so on, including collapsing buildings. And this we do not do too well. This is a place that we need to improve in terms of our capacity to design towns that are resilient. Actually, what you're talking about is designing urban systems that are very, very resilient. Okay,
Exactly, yeah.
and resilient is a big word. It can mean anything, but in terms of our conversation, we're talking about resilience from the point of view of ability to withstand flooding or fires or hunger, whatever it is
no
that,
matter what it is.
whatever it is that is the emergency, that this system can withstand that. But it doesn't work very well if it doesn't have good policies and municipal authorities that have the preparedness and the early warning signals that are required for the whole to work in tandem. That's very, very important. Okay?
So where are the gaps? Do you feel like, do we have good policy, or do we have people who are what's it called, evil actors in this space? Because sometimes I tend to think that
You're prodding me to mispronounce myself. There are many evil actors. There are many evil actors. I think you need to know that evil action is motivated by profits, and when people have huge potential profits in the offing, ethical behavior does not, motivate them. Okay, it does not, make them do the right things. It doesn't appeal at all. So there will be evil players, and evil players are part and parcel of our policy making system, because sometimes you elect leaders who are not very sensitive to good policy, and that can be potentially problematic, because then when you want quality leadership to be able to help, prepare plans that respect and respond to a disaster preparedness regime, or to create resilient urban systems or even rural systems, then you get people saying we don't have money for this because they do not see the immediate gains from a political point of view. Okay, and because they are here for short-term expediency reasons, sometimes when you have proposals that include building into the urban systems resilience, it costs money that sometimes, as the political class, they do not endorse in their budgets. So you're constrained by budgets to build systems that are not as responsive as they could be. Sometimes the political class is slow to approve policies and programs that are required to be in place in good time to remove the potential of such emergencies, leading into fatalities and reducing the amount of impact that is caused. So that's the regime, really. That really is the problem. But it doesn't mean that there are no people of goodwill there. It doesn't mean that there are no people that are qualified to contribute towards creating such resilient urban systems, such policies that can help to improve the response towards disasters and emergencies. But at the end of the day, you've got to have all the elements that are required in place for it to be an efficient system. Okay?
I would think they should be under standard operating procedures for either the bodies that are involved, whether it's professional bodies such as, I guess, the architectural associations that we have, engineering associations that we have. So I think there has to be a level of engagement that brings all these players together. And what I struggle to see in Kenya is there communication between these professional bodies and the national government and other private entities, or is it that we usually just come together when these things happen? And granted, disasters is something that you can't plan for. It's something that, you can plan for. Sorry, I take that back. You can plan for it, but it's something that doesn't happen. What's the word? Like you can't
spontaneous.
You can't anticipate.
Yeah. Okay. Sometimes you try to anticipate. Okay. When you build systems, if you're going to build resilient systems, then your objective is really to try and predict what can happen in spaces, depending on the vulnerabilities. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I did say that if you're in different environments, the threats come from different things. Okay. So you've got to simulate. You've got to simulate that environment, and when you design your city, then you know that the threat to this city is either going to come from that mountain, or from that bushfire, or from the forest fire, or from tornadoes, and typhoons, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's what you do. You do your simulation. Today, fortunately, you can simulate. You can have all computer models that you can simulate to give you the best parameters to design a city. But for some strange reason, Kenyans are loath to do things the best professional way. And that's what really annoys me. I get very disappointed when Kenyans think that doing things professionally is just speaking in a lot of English.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so that can be problematic, but it's not beyond the professionals. It's not beyond the government, particularly in keeping to the question that you asked. I think it is important that people understand that in advanced countries, the reason they establish municipal authorities is because they understand that you need to bring these services, including the emergency services, very close to the people.
Yeah.
And not too far from, if you're going to have a good disaster management program, then Nairobi would be needing, Nairobi has 17 sub-counties.
Yeah.
Nairobi should be having 17 fire brigades. For example,
Yeah.
Nairobi should be having preparedness to mitigate disaster in 17 places, because you've got to decentralize this function so that people do not have to travel 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers in huge traffic to get to a spot where an emergency has occurred.
Yeah.
Okay? So when people speak about decentralization in the city, they think it is administrative. No, it's not for administrative purposes. It's for management of the city. It is for the city to be able to be to respond in a very rapid manner to situations on the ground. Okay, particularly where a huge number of population concentrations is involved, and this logic does not fall very well. Does not sit very well with some people, and it surprises me that they are in office and yet they cannot see how important some of these things are. So when we talk about decentralization, we are not talking about politics. People, we're not talking about politics. We're talking about preparedness to do things at a local level.
Yeah, which is needed.
Yeah.
I mean, we have so many examples. We see how in Japan the buildings are built to a certain standard to withstand the numerous earthquakes that these people face.
Of course, the building code, the building code in
At a
Japan is
municipal level.
tailored to meet those requirements. Okay, so that's important.
So when you think about it, the disasters that I think Kenyans right now are facing on a recurring basis is road accidents. One, I think illicit brews is another one that keeps coming up all the time.
Well, speaking about road accidents, for example, how many emergency stations do we have between Kisumu and Nairobi?
No one knows.
Do you know of any one emergency
I don't
response
even know what.
station
I don't know.
along those 340 odd kilometers?
I don't even know. A
Okay.
single one,
Why isn't there an emergency response station at Salga, which has been one of the greatest accident black spots? Why isn't there a fire station there? Fire brigade? Why isn't there a mini hospital there, for example? If you go to a country like Swaziland, they have these things and they established them long time ago, like in 1990.
Yeah.
If you travel along a highway in Swaziland, you'll find fire stations along the highway. Why isn't that the case here? So those emergency stations, if you're talking about highway emergency response, you should have a fire brigade there, to be able to catch the cars and disentangle them and save lives. If it's a fire, it should be well within their ability to reach this emergency spot in good time and so on and save lives. If it is to deal with first aid to the patients or to the victims, that also is something that is achievable. And it's not for lack of money in this country. It is for lack of goodwill. It's for lack of, proactive behavior. Okay, action. And that we can do.
And so my feeling is that there's a lot to be done. Just having this conversation with you, feel like there's policy that needs to be enhanced or pushed more.
Yes.
And I guess that really concludes this conversation for today, because I think we've said everything we need to say. I think our listeners have gotten a chance to get our perspective. I hope that preventative measures become something that we actually ingrain into our own societies. And I think that's it from me. I don't know whether
well, I hope you've got some of the answers to the questions that you've asked. This is by no means exhaustive. It's just a tip of the iceberg. You can have these conversations broken down to specific areas of disaster management or emergency response, and I think we do not pretend to be giving a total solution here at all. Not in any way. I think we're just giving some perspectives here, sharing perspectives on what the range of incidents could be, and what the policy framework should be like, and what the leadership, political or otherwise, and this very strategic place when it comes to the urban sector of municipal systems. And I think that's something that we can continue in another episode. So thank you, Caleb.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay.